Hi, I'm Ashley Osborne, PropTech pioneer and CEO and co-founder of Devour PropTech, the digital platform that levels the playing field for smart property investors. Today, I want to talk to you about different types of property ownership. Now, there's four primary types of property ownership in the UK. They are freehold, share of freehold, common hold, and leasehold. If you think about property ownership, it has lots of different rights, but the main rights that it has are called institutional rights. And that talks about the things you can do when you own a property. What rights do you have to actually deal with the property and do different things with it? Now, the highest level of ownership is called freehold. And the easiest way of thinking about freehold is if you think about each of those different institutional rights being a stick, then freehold ownership is a bundle of all of those sticks that you have at the same time. So essentially, you've got what is called ownership in fee simple, which means that you have the highest level of ownership in the property. And what that means in practice is it means that you've got the right to sublease, to do whatever you like with the property, and you actually own not only the property, but the land that it sits on. The main advantage for you as a freeholder, if you own the freehold, is essentially you don't require permission from anybody to do anything with the property. So if you don't need the permission of a superior owner to get a pet or to alter the building or to do renovations or anything like that. So essentially there's nobody for you to answer to. But the biggest drawback of being a freeholder is not only do you need to maintain the inside of the property, you've also got to maintain the building and the land that it sits on. So things like dealing with insuring the building, maintaining the property, maintaining the windows and the exterior of the building are all things that are required to be done by you as the investor. The next thing that sits down the ownership scale, if you like, is share of freehold. So what share of freehold is, it's essentially the same thing as a freehold, except that freehold ownership is split up through a number of owners. So for example, if there's a block of apartments and each person owns part of that block, then they would own a share of the freehold. Share of freehold can be divided individually by up to 4 people if it's done as individuals, or alternatively, if it's for more than 4 people, then it's by creating a company, and that company then is owned by all of the different share of freeholders. They're called common holders together. Now, the main advantage of share of freehold over other forms of ownership is you have rights that are similar to what you would have as a freeholder. So you participate with the other common holders in making decisions about the property. So for example, if you want to appoint a cleaner or somebody to maintain the building or do insurance, you get to collectively make that decision together with the other common holders and have a direct input into the management of your building. Common hold is one of the next levels of ownership down, and common hold, unlike the name suggests, is actually not particularly common in the UK. It's actually very, very similar to something like strata titled ownership in the places like Australia and New Zealand. And essentially what it does is it creates a common holding structure and then divides part of the ownership between multiple owners. It's really, really uncommon. It's not something that many people are familiar with in the UK, and it's probably something that, unless you're really familiar with it, you should probably avoid. The final primary type of ownership of real estate in the UK is leasehold. Now, leasehold is very different to all of the other types of ownership we've talked about previously. Leasehold is where you own a lease over part of the building, and the lease is granted to you by the landlord, who is essentially the person that owns the building and the land that it sits on. You get a tenancy agreement which grants you the right to use and occupy the demised premises, which is the area you rent, within the building for a period of time. Now, what people get confused about with leasehold versus freehold is it's not necessarily a lesser type of ownership. The reality is, in many situations, it's impossible to create anything other than a leasehold. So for example, a large block of apartments, it's realistically very difficult to grant everybody a freehold ownership. So leasehold is the common and prevailing type of ownership. One of the major disadvantages of leasehold is that you can't deal with the property yourself without the permission of the landlord. So even to do things like get a pet, you might find that you require the permission of the freeholder to do that. And one of the other big drawbacks is that you have to pay a ground rent for the lease each year as well. But on the other side of the coin, as a leaseholder, one of the main advantages for you is that you don't have to deal with the property. So you're not responsible for the maintenance of the property. You don't have to deal with organising cleaners, etc. There's a management company that is responsible for the management of the building and the insurance of the building, and you essentially pay a management charge each year or month, which is called a service charge, for the management of the property. Leasehold is fine as a form of ownership, but there's two things that you really need to think about before you enter a leasehold agreement, and there's been investors that have been caught out in the past. First is, how much is the ground rent and what are the provisions for its review? So for example, it wasn't so long ago that developers were creating leaseholds, ownership structures where the ground rent doubled every 5 or maybe 10 years. Now, it doesn't sound like a great deal, but it can be quite problematic once you start compounding that growth. It might mean that your service charge goes from, say, your ground rent, goes from £300 per year to £10,000 a year over a 20 or 30 year period. So you need to be quite mindful of that. And the second thing is, what costs is the management company going to charge you to actually deal with the property? You want to make sure that there's somebody responsible for managing the property that deals with it quickly, that you don't have to pay a lot of money just to get permission to, say, renovate the property or get a pet or whatever it is. And finally, it doesn't come up very often with new build, but if the lease for a property is what's called a wasting asset, because there's only a limited time period for the lease, and the more the lease expires, the less the value of the property. In the UK, once a property has got a lease which is less than 80 years, it's very difficult to get a mortgage, and it's also very difficult to sell it. There are provisions within the UK that let you extend the lease relatively easily, but it can be quite an expensive process. So you need to make sure that there's enough time left on the lease before expiry if you're going to buy that property. It really should be more than 80 years remaining on the lease. I hope you found this information useful. If you have, please like our video, subscribe to our channel, make a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.